In 1986, the world with dread had become aware of a distant place in the heart of the Soviet Union, a place of death called Chernobyl. In that year, a reactor there had exploded, causing the worst nuclear disaster ever. Since then, for 36 years, Chernobyl has remained radioactive, large parts shielded behind exclusion zones and even today approached with trepidation. But that did not stop invading Russian troops to take control of the decommissioned nuclear plant. Ukrainian leaders are warning that after the senseless Russian attack, it is impossible to say that Chernobyl is safe. They warn that Europe itself may be in danger.
130 kilometers north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, lies Chernobyl, the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster ever. A faulty reactor led to an explosion in 1986 in what was then the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, an integral part of USSR. 36 years later, Russia is back in control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
Sadly, I have to inform you that as of now, the Chernobyl zone, the so-called Chernobyl exclusion zone, and all the structures of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant are under the control of Russian armed groups.
According to reports from Ukraine, Russian special forces occupied the entire Chernobyl area that includes a 32-kilometer radius exclusion zone around the plant that is stuck in a time wrap, having been devoid of human life for 36 years since the explosion in 1986. Chernobyl, to the north of Ukraine, sits right at the border with neighboring Belarus. The Chernobyl radioactive zone is spread across both Ukraine and Belarus. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant had been completely decommissioned, and with no human habitation in its vicinity, it has largely been a spot of controlled tourist interest. An international team has been working at Chernobyl, collaborating on the construction of a 32,000-ton dome around the radioactive reactor. 30 years ago, when Ukraine declared its independence, it had the third biggest pile of nuclear weaponry in the world. That was its share of the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. Only USA and Russia had more. But in 1994, Ukraine had willingly given up its entire stockpile for the sake of peace. Both US and Russia stood guarantors to Ukraine's peace, signaling that Ukraine will never be in need of such weapons. In 2014, Putin went back on the promise that Russia had made and ordered the annexation of Crimea. Nuclear power plants house dangerous radioactive material. Even after years of cooling, spent fuel can release fatal doses of radiation in a very short span of time. And depending on weather conditions and which way the wind is blowing, a nuclear mishap is capable of spreading disaster in a radius hundreds of kilometers wide from where the actual power plant is.
News of the attack on a nuclear power plant in Ukraine has sent shudders around the world. According to Ukrainian officials, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant took a direct hit, and the fears are that with war raging in the country, the chances of a nuclear disaster loom large, something that will not be limited to Ukraine but may impact large portions of Europe and even Asia. Here's a list of dangers that a nuclear power plant faces during war.
The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine is the second biggest in Europe, housing 6 of the country's 15 reactors. The plant at full capacity accounts for 20% of Ukraine's electricity requirements. With Zaporizhzhia being hit, the natural fear of nuclear disaster looms large over this war with Russia. And already there are reports of radiation levels spiking at Chernobyl, as well as missiles hitting radioactive waste disposal sites in Ukraine. In a letter dated March 1, Russia, as per protocol, informed the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, that its military forces have taken control of the territory around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. On 4th of March, Ukraine announced that one of the reactors at the plant had taken a direct hit, setting off the fires. The official confirmed that the particular reactor was under renovation and not operational, but that there is nuclear fuel inside. And naturally, all around the world, there is dread of what could happen. Nuclear reactors are built to withstand even an aircraft crashing into them, but they need constant supervision and maintenance by trained staff. The danger of Ukrainian nuclear power plant going out of control during this war would depend on the gap in time from when the Ukrainian operators flee to when the Russian nuclear operators take over. Nuclear reactors are especially vulnerable in the event of an electricity failure during war. If a plant's power supply gets cut, this impacts reactor cooling and the cooling of spent fuel storage that is contained within relatively light walls. This could lead to a Fukushima-like meltdown and massive release of radioactive material.
Under normal circumstances, the likelihood of a reactor losing power and of the emergency diesel generators being damaged and of not being able to repair that equipment quickly is very, very small. But in a war, all of these different failures that would have to happen for a reactor to become damaged and melt down, the likelihood of all of those happening becomes much more likely than it does in peacetime.
Zaporizhzhia is vulnerable because some of the reactors were built and designed half a century ago and may well be past the original 40-year lifespan. These make the old reactors doubly susceptible to war damage. In case of a direct missile hit on structures built for spent fuel containment, it could destroy the structures, leading to massive levels of radioactivity that could spread all over the place depending on which way the wind blows. Russia understands this, as the Russian border is not very far away to the east. At the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, water from the Dnieper River is used to cool the reactors. If the dams and reservoirs upstream get damaged due to the war impacting the supply of water, the nuclear fuel could begin to overheat and evaporate to a point where the fuel metal cladding could ignite and release most of the radioactive material into the atmosphere.
As long as there is backup power and the fuel doesn't melt, the water can remain cool and the plant is safe. So the real critical question is whether there is still a continued supply of electricity to run the cooling pumps so that the fuel remains intact. If so, then the plant can be safe indefinitely as long as the power remains there, but that's a big if in a war zone.
Ukraine has 15 operational nuclear reactors, of which 9 were running when the Russian forces invaded the country. This is the first time in history that a war of this magnitude is raging in the close proximity of so much radioactive nuclear material, including thousands of tons of highly radioactive spent fuel. The threat of nuclear disaster hangs not just over Ukraine, but the entire landmass of Europe and beyond. And that includes large swathes of Russia as well.
There are 44 million Ukrainians and there is one Vladimir Putin in Russia who has chosen to decide their fates. One man's call to war has hit the entire world. There are Ukrainians and Russians dying in the snow-covered fields and roads leading to Kiev. But what does Putin want? Why is he waging war with such flimsy excuses? Is this about legacy or is this about geopolitics? The answer lies in Moscow, with a 69-year-old former KGB spy who is today the president of the Russian Federation.
I am ceasing my activities in the post of President of the USSR.
Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, announced that the USSR had ceased to be. 15 republics that had made up the Union declared themselves independent, individual entities. The Republic of Ukraine had overwhelmingly voted for its independence.
The world calls the end of an era, Gorbachev's resignation, and the last lowering of the Soviet flag that flew over the Kremlin dome were mourned by few of the people who had passed their lives under that flag.
Weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin had quit the now defunct and one-time dreaded KGB and was on his way to St. Petersburg. His world lay shattered around him. His future looked bleak.
Клянусь при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации.
Decades later, as the president of the Russian Federation, he would call the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century.
По воле народа. Законно и мирно.
Who is Vladimir Putin? This former KGB agent, his aura very carefully crafted, meticulously drafted. Like in 2008, when he was Prime Minister, Putin, along with journalists, was visiting a wildlife reserve in Siberia when a tiger charged towards a TV crew. Before anyone else could react, Putin apparently shot the beast and sedated it with a tranquilizer gun. This was reported as a headline on Russia television, but the action was never captured on camera. Years later, in an interview to a Russian magazine, Putin admitted that the incident was staged. It was done to draw attention to a species under threat, he claimed. And that seems to sum up the driving philosophy of Vladimir Putin. Trained in the elite spy school of Soviet Union, he remains a master of misdirection.
The Russian Federation, there will be no war. We don't want war, but we will not allow violating our interests.
The force driving Vladimir Putin seems to be his desire to make Russia great again. A throwback to the days of the Tsars and even to the Soviet Union, when Moscow held control over the largest political entity that stretched from Western Europe all the way across the Asian landmass to Cape Dezhnev on the Bering Strait. In the process, Putin has gathered powers that has rendered him Tsar of all he surveys, while undermining the institutions that strengthen democracy. Russia under Putin is a totalitarian system where the parliament is toothless in its opposition. Over the years, Putin has managed to change and modify the rules, eroding many of the key features of the federal system that developed when Russia became an independent federation. Imposing greater central control over the regions was one of the first reforms that Putin addressed on coming to power.
There was Alexander the Liberator and Yaroslav the Wise. We will have Vladimir, the underwear poisoner. That is how he will go down in history.
His detractors have been jailed, the latest and most formidable being Alexei Navalny, the leader of the Russian opposition. Before he was jailed, he had survived an assassination attempt. Many believe it was Vladimir Putin who had ordered his assassination with a Soviet-era nerve agent called Novichok. Navalny miraculously survived that attempt on his life, but soon lost his freedom and still languishes in prison on charges that are considered trumped up. Under Putin's regime, Russia's courts are said to lack independence, and they remain subject to political pressure.
They're offering them the chance to surrender, that they will be treated with respect and allowed to return to their families.
In President Putin's Russia, the media is no longer seen as speaking truth to power. TV stations are owned by oligarchs who are considered close to the regime. And the reportage has been accused of being consistently pro-establishment. So while thousands of Russians have bravely hit the streets to protest their country waging war with Ukraine, Russian TV channels have been towing the government line of justifying Putin's war in Ukraine.
Once again, I appeal to the servicemen of Ukrainian armed forces. Don't let neo-Nazis and Banderites use your children, your wives, and old people as human shields. Take power into your own hands. It seems that it will be easier for us to come to terms with you than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kyiv and took all Ukrainian people hostage.
30 years ago, when Ukraine declared its independence, it had the third biggest pile of nuclear weaponry in the world. That was its share of the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. Only USA and Russia had more. But in 1994, Ukraine had willingly given up its entire stockpile for the sake of peace. Both US and Russia stood guarantors to Ukraine's peace, signaling that Ukraine will never be in need of such weapons. In 2014, Putin went back on the promise that Russia had made and ordered the annexation of Crimea.
Let's imagine that Ukraine is a NATO member. It is fully packed of weapons. It gets advanced attack means like those in Poland and Romania, and it starts an operation in Crimea. I don't even talk about Donbass. Crimea is a sovereign Russian territory. Let's imagine that Ukraine is a NATO member state and it initiates a military operation. What should we do then? Should we fight against the NATO bloc? Did anyone think at least something about that?
The annexation of Crimea in 2014 stamped Putin's legacy as what began to be termed the gatherer of Russian lands. Vladimir Putin became not only the longest-serving leader in Moscow after Stalin, but also the first ruler since then to expand Russian territory. Approaching his 70th birthday, the president of the Russian Federation now seems to be consumed by a desire to reunify Ruski Mir, or the Russian order. A desire that would mean that Ukraine has to be brought back to the Russian fold, an association that stretches back 1,000 years of shared history. Never entirely untangled, the separation of identities remain turbulent to the day.
Уважаемые коллеги, вы видите, что западные страны предпринимают не
Dear colleagues, you see that not only are the Western countries engaged in unfriendly action towards our country in economic field, I'm talking about illegitimate sanctions everyone knows about very well. But the top NATO member countries' officials allow themselves aggressive statements towards our country as well. That's why I'm ordering the defense minister and chief of the general staff to switch the Russian army's deterrent forces into high alert mode of combat standby duty.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine is ostensibly to teach its leaders not to tango with the West. A warning to NATO to stay off Russian borders and to stop their eastward extension. But whatever be the reasoning, stretching from Putin's alleged megalomania to claimed genuine geopolitical considerations, the fallout is going to be harsh.
Important Russian banks will be excluded from the SWIFT system. We will also ban the transactions of Russia's central bank and freeze all its assets to prevent it from financing Putin's war. And we will target the assets of Russian oligarchs.
Overall, we'll be imposing asset freezes on more than 100 new entities and individuals. Next, on top of these financial measures and in full concert with the United States and the EU, we will introduce new trade restrictions and stringent export controls similar to those that they in the US are implementing. We will bring forward new legislation to ban the export of all dual-use items to Russia.
So I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions.
The Western powers have hit back at Putin with a slew of sanctions. Even as Vladimir Putin continues to spill blood in Ukraine, Russians and Ukrainians are dying in war that has not much reason behind its cause. Europe stares at destabilization, Ukraine at ruin, and Russia at economic dilapidation. The ruble has tanked. The Russian stock market, facing a crash, has been shut for days. Most of Russia's $630 billion worth of forex reserves lies frozen. Europe has shut its airspace to Russian aircraft. The world is refusing to play sport with Russia, and the president of the Russian Federation has only upped the ante. Putin has ordered Russian nuclear forces on alert. No one knows what Putin wants. No one knows how far he'll go. The world watches in trepidation as life hangs in balance. And peace remains subject to the demons that plague the fantasy of a single man.